Hi, it's Dr. Michael McNeil here. I'm going to do something a bit different today. Earlier in the week, I was having a conversation with someone. I'm trying to keep it as anonymous, anonymous as possible, and but it reminded me of my own early life. Well, when I say early life, sort of like time, say between 13 and 16 years old, and so I'm just going to talk a bit about that. I've got no idea how it's going to come out, but the person I was talking to, just trying to how to put this to, but they were having a lot. They were having a lot of trouble, and they were telling about one of their children, and it reminded me so vividly of my own of this period of my life between, say, I was 13 and 16, and I grew up in a very it was a loving family, and but it was a place of lots of violence, lots of alcohol. Not so much in our house and in our normal sort of like life, but my dad drank a lot. Was often out. Often before he would come home 2 3 times a week, he'd be late in because he would have gone to the pub when he was coming home and stuff, and there was some sort of like some very vivid times of sort of like of unpleasantness, and there was some particularly nasty sort of like episodes sort of like growing up, and I can and even though I call him my dad, he was my sort of like my stepdad, and my mum, I was actually born. This is it's like a blues song when I think about when I was born. I was actually born in the Salvation Army hostel for. I'm gonna I'll apologise sort of like first thing now. I might get quite emotional during this, and so you'll have to excuse me sort of like choking up and everything. But I apologise for for the, it might be a little bit staccato as I tear up a little bit. But it was the Salvation Army hostel for unmarried women. This was 1967. I was born in 1967. So, and lots of people think of the 1960s as this great time of great progressive liberation, and in some ways it was, but it was still extremely uncool for, I don't know what it was like in the States, but in the Britain, maybe Europe was slightly different, but I don't think it was that different, much different on the continent of Europe. But it was still very, very uncool to be an unmarried mother, and so, and sort of like putting two and two together, and there was some stuff going on, and and my mum's family, very working class family. Sort of my granddad, he worked down the pit for, he's a coal miner, and they worked down the pit for 40, 50 years, and they're sort of hard living people and stuff, and whereas sort of like my stepdad was from sort of like a little fishing village in Scotland, but they were hard living people too, and there was lots of alcohol and violence and stuff, and my dad's dad didn't come back from the war, so he was brought up with these loud, aggressive, drinking, smoking, rough Scotsman, and so, and somehow I think it was when my mum and dad met in I think it was art college, and because my mum was very much sort of like fine design, fashion type sort of art, that type of stuff, whereas my dad was very much more sort of abstract art. Some of his work was amazing actually, sort of like abstract art, but or sort of almost like surrealist type art, and he was very talented as well, but they didn't, neither of them really went into sort of like art sort of careers. They sort of like went more into sort of like teaching and lecturing and stuff. My dad used to do a general studies course, and my mum, but the problem was every time my mum worked, my dad would give her like bills and stuff, like, so that you'd have more beer money. And so it was like, so I think for a lot of the time my mum didn't work and she was just looking after us sort of like at home, and my dad was off, and so basically, grew up very much with mum. But sort of right, return there. So, and when there was lots of stuff that went on during my young life, when I look back on it, and a lot of it was connected to with the fact that I wasn't, a lot of the hostility and some of the violence that I experienced personally was connected with the fact that I wasn't sort of like my dad's biological son. Yeah, and so there was some stuff that happened. I love my dad, and my dad gave me so much. And just very much a lot of, in a sense, my academic discipline, and what I went on to do with my life, a lot of it came from that, came from my from from my dad. So what I'm saying here, or what I'm sharing here, isn't meant to in any way malign or criticize my dad. We're all imperfect vessels, and we're all, we've all got major hang-ups. We've all got sort of like mental health things and stuff, and so I can understand this much more as a in a sense, my as a mature adult now. I can understand a lot of the stuff that was going on between my mum and my dad and stuff, and so this is not meant to be that, but there was some periods of sort of like intense violence that I suffered, and I think this made me sort of like, particularly during sort of like my teenage years, I suffered sort of I suffered with my own mental stability quite a lot, and so I can remember. I'm always been very sort of like I started off. I was very interested in science and technical things, and I ended up doing my first sort of like 2 degrees where I did a BSc in electrical electronic engineering, and I did a master's in electronic engineering, and I was very, very interested in sort of like in science and technical things. And I can remember very, very vividly, it was some sort of news report when I was 13, and I was watching it, and it was sort of like right at the dawning. It must have been, I think this must have been, because we were still there, we moved in 1982, so this must have been like 1980, 1981. And sort of like, sort of like computers were becoming, were sort of just sort of emerging into sort of like the public consciousness, you could say. And I can remember I was watching this news program, and it just featured somebody, and it was like they were at like some sort of terminal, and they had like the radar thing going around, and this thought came to me: you'll never be able to do that. It's going to be too difficult for you to live life. You'll never be able to do that. And that sort of thought became like that triggered in me an absolute mental breakdown, and I suffered for sort of like for the next 3 years with a cycle of, I think it's called Manic Depression, where you sort of you almost can't function as a human being for a period, and it was such a struggle to just try and live normal life, because obviously you're 13, 14, you have to, you haven't, particularly in my time, you don't have any choice about whether or not you went to school. You just went to school otherwise there was an educational welfare officer that appeared, within a very short period of time, and you were made to go to school somewhere. There was not that sort of like toleration of, not people just not going to school. People either had to go to special schools, or they went, whatever it was. Parents were being prosecuted for not sending their children to school, all sorts of stuff. I think things are quite a lot more lax now, and it's much easier to homeschool people, or it's through. But so I didn't have any conception in myself. I mean, that was the remarkable thing, was that I didn't have any understanding that even though I felt completely paralyzed inside myself, and I was emotionally utterly crippled, and I could barely function. I was sort of like trying to be in lessons and trying to. It's just like I had this constant. It was constant, negative, despairing. I've got absolutely no reason to live. There's no purpose. There's no reason to go on in life. There's no. Nothing is ever going to change. It's always going to be like this. Even if I grow up, I'm going to be exactly like my parents, which was like, to me, was that particularly I'm going to end up like my dad. If somebody said to me, this was a little bit later in my life, sort of like 17, 18, 19, if somebody ever said to me, you're going to end up like your dad, I would like explode. And it's not like I really wanted to explode emotionally on the inside of it. I would just explode. There was just this sort of visceral reaction. I didn't, it wasn't as if somebody was provoking it. It would come up and it would explode. And it was that sort of, absolutely, there was nothing I wanted to be. I did not want to be, it was weird, because in one sense I would think, yeah, my dad had some good qualities, but there was no way I wanted to be like my dad. I suppose, there was a lot of, because I could see, when you see your mum suffer, or, I'm not saying, that my mum and dad did have some times where there was where they fought physically. Those were relatively few, but how my dad was, how my dad would control my mum was just this mental. He would control us by violence, in the sense of shouting and verbal violence, but it was the mental manipulation and stuff which was really quite, and when you see somebody really suffer, and I could really see my mum suffering, and you sort of like, you're growing up with this, and there's nothing you can do, and that, I think, was part of this utter despair that I had about living and wanting to go on with life, and feeling there was no hope, no future. And so, I sort of like being in this school, sort of like this school environment, and all the, all your relationships are just totally dysfunctional because you can't communicate properly, and you're sort of, I was never completely sort of like, in a sense, there was times where I felt, utterly, completely, totally isolated, because you couldn't really talk to anybody. Others, family, other sort of like, pupils who were sort of like around, all their families seemed to be like together, and their parents liked each other and got on, and they went on holidays, because I can't remember us ever going on holiday as a family, other than days out. And even then, most of the time, it would just be one sort of like parent. It was very, very rare, and particularly, I think, from sort of 10, 11 years old, I can't ever remember us actually going anywhere. We never went, say, abroad on a holiday together, ever. And so it was a really sort of, untypical sort of lives. But I would always constantly be seeing all these other families, or all these other parents, or our neighbours and stuff like that, and they were like normal, and we weren't, and I acutely felt that, and I suppose in some ways I acutely felt that as a person within our family as well, because obviously my brothers and my sisters, I never knew that, I never understood this at the time. There was a strange sort of like dynamic, but I never understood why am I different. What is different about me than sort of like my brother and sister, and then we had my mum and dad they had 3 more children sort of like later on in life, so there was quite a big gap between us. So we got 2 groups of brothers and sisters, and we all basically got on. We sort we're not we do sort of like love each other. We do get on. There has been there's always sort of like there's been things that you might say and just awkward patches and things, but I think basically we all still get on, and we do. Because we get a bit more in age, and age catches up with people a bit, and it's a bit difficult for people to gather. And one of my brothers has moved to Australia and stuff, but I sort of this triggered that, just seeing that sort of like news report really triggered this, and with manic depression you get very, very down for a period, then you go up and you're super high up, and you think you can conquer the world, and then suddenly I can remember it used to be within a couple of hours, within one day, suddenly you would crash right down again, right to the bottom, utter, complete, total despair. And during the worst of that sort of time, I actually tried to commit suicide 3 different times during those 3 years, and one time I nearly succeeded. Other 2 times I tried. One time I tried to sort of like poison myself by ingesting something. That didn't go well. that was very unpleasant, but I survived. But other couple of times actually, sort of like amazingly, I have no scars. But I'd actually very, very. I sort of like pierced the main artery, sort of like in my wrist, and I can remember on the time where the second time in particular there was a lot of blood, and I can remember knowing and being aware that I didn't actually really want to die, but I felt as if there was no way I could live either, and it was and the worst thing was, and I couldn't talk to anybody either. I think I tried talking to my dad once when we were walking on, because when I was totally mentally, I thought, can my dad help? And I can remember actually asking, what do I do? How do I do it? And I think the problem was as well, one of the worst. It was one of the worst sort of like periods. It was a great time of change for him as well, because we were moving from where we'd grown up. We grew up in a place called Colchester, so like in Essex, which is like 40, 50 miles north of London, and sort of northeast of London, sort of like on the A12. We'd sort of like grown up there, and my dad had sort of like progressed on a bit, and then we moved out to sort of like the suburbs of the town, out a little sort of like nice little sort of like village called Wivenhoe at that time, which is now a big village with lots of places. But I was born in the northeast of England, but about when I was about 6 months, when my mum and dad met, we moved. They ended up in Colchester. I think it's just when my dad got a job. I don't know how he got a job in Colchester, but basically my young life until I was 14 was there, and I can remember this was just before we'd moved to Leicester, which is more in the middle of England, and I can remember and I knew this was like a transition phase, and I was just absolutely terrified of moving to a new place, because I was so fragile in myself. And I can remember trying to talk. I said to my dad, what do I do? I can remember we were walking along Queen's Hill in Wivenhoe, and I can just remember being there with Dad, and I was looking, and I was really asking him. I wasn't like saying, what do I do? And whatever it was my dad said, I think my dad was trying to answer me, but I don't think he knew how to answer, if you know what I mean, because I don't think he understood me. I don't think he actually understood what the state I was in. And I don't think to be honest, I think my mum got a little bit of a glimpse, because I can remember going into my mum when there was blood coming out of my wrists one time, and so my mum knew, but I don't, I was just sort of, somehow it was weird, because I would sort of try and keep it together when I was in school or anything, but I just had this it was an utter black pit of depression, and suddenly you'd be high up in this super high, and you'd do loads of things, and then suddenly something would happen, you crash down. And when you sort of like you're 14 and you move to a different area, and you know you've got a different accent, because the southern accent is very different from sort of like the Midlands accent in the UK, and so and you've got no friends, and you're in this sort of that compounded in many ways this sort of utter despair I had about living in life, and it was very, and it was like I just existed for those sort of times, up and down, up and up and up and down. It was a bit like a 2 or 3 week cycle, sort of like, you know, it'd be up and down. And I can just remember I was having to do physics homework for what it's now, I think they're now called GCSEs. In my day they were called O levels, ordinary level. It's just like a school sort of exam before you go. It's like we used to have O levels, A levels, which were like your pre-university sort of like courses for 2 years, and then you go to university, or you know, I suppose in the US it's a bit like going to college or something. But our O levels were like graduating from high school. I think in the US it's called graduation. Lots of countries on continental Europe, you know, you graduate, don't you, from high school to where you're going to your pre-university time, and then you go to university. And I was doing sort of like what we'd now call sort of like, I was doing some physics homework, and I can remember I was in one of these downer sort of like phases, but I just slogged it out trying to do this homework, and I managed to do it. And I can remember looking at this piece of homework, and I thought, even though I was depressed, I managed to get through this. And that, just as much as I thought 3 or 4 years earlier had sort of like completely crippled me and caused me to totally collapse emotionally, it was like that one thought got me out of that forever. Now that doesn't mean that something changed in me that day, and somehow I knew that I could get through. Now that doesn't mean I thought life was great, because I didn't, and things when I was about 17, things got really very, very nasty, and I left home when I was 17, and I ended up living in this hostel for you know, it's just like young people who are homeless sort of, because we weren't really allowed to do much when we were sort of like growing up. We weren't really allowed to go out or go to concerts or anything like that. I went completely berserk for sort of like 3 or 4 years, just and you know, drinking, smoking, doing drugs, and you know, just absolute, and you know, I nearly destroyed myself basically. You know, I nearly and it was at the end of that sort of like phase when I tried to make some changes in my life, had a major overdose, and I nearly died. And you know, like dying, leaving your body, and that's when I made a deal with God and said, if you're really real, I'll promise I'll go to the church tomorrow. I've got this sort of testimony longhand written out it's an unpublished book, but it's a book I did years and years and years ago in 1992, I think, where I was trying to explain. It just started off as a book where I was trying to explain to people I was sharing a house with who were from really diverse cultures and different part of the world what being a Christian was. But the appendix of that book, which I'll put a link in the link, was sort of like a long version of this sort of what you might call a testimony of how I came to faith. But I still struggle even now, and I think for the first 10 years of being, say, a believer, because I became a believer at the end of my first year at university, so it's like 1989, and so this was about, say, probably we moved to Leicester in 1982. I came out the other side of depression probably when I was about 15, 16, which might have been 1986, 87. So, and then I was like this sort of like gap of like being a prodigal for those 3 or 4 years. And then, you know, I came to faith, but it was like another sort of like 10 years of being a believer where I still sometimes would have it was almost like a physical fight with depression, and it's like you can feel like it's like a plug hole. If you imagine water on a big plug hole, you get right into there and suddenly you're sucked down. And I can remember there was times where I would be struggling for fighting with everything that was inside me to stop me going down this black hole of depression, and doing everything I possibly could to stop myself going down that hole. And there was some things that needed to happen, and people talk about sort of like having, when people sort of like have very powerful sort of like flashbacks or encounters, or they experience healing, very sort of like cathartic, or you have a very intense experience of. There was various sort of like points and milestones along the road where I, had spiritual deliverance, and stuff got out of my life, and I went back to. It's like sometimes you go back to places where, or go back to events that I didn't understand, that caused me to behave in a certain way in your life, can be defining. I mean, this is very well understood in sort of like in psychiatry and psychology, where things can be formative in you and you don't know why you behave in a particular way. I mean, I will share one of them. I can remember was one night I played music enormous amount. I learned to play guitar when I was about 17, 18. Just because there was a guy in the hostel that lived in a room opposite me, and he was a brilliant guitarist. So it was like a guy, it's called Nick, and he was a brilliant guitarist. And he really inspired me to take up the guitar, and I struggled for 6 months. I couldn't even tune a guitar for 6 months. I just couldn't get it in tune. Just totally complete. I didn't really do any music or anything. I was totally tone deaf when I was sort of like growing up. I loved music, but I just couldn't. I just couldn't tune the guitar. And 1990, it was actually 1991 or 1992. I was doing MSc in electronics, and some nights I used to work really late, sort of like overnight in the, because when you're a graduate student you could get like a special pass and go into the sort of like into the labs and things. And I can remember there was one night, and I was, I think I'd come home, and I just started sort of, I was just having like a little bit of sort of like playing a bit of music or something, playing guitar and stuff, and then I started to just sort of like pray and say thank you to God, thank you to the Lord, and for some reason I closed. I wanted to be in the dark, so I sort of like closed the a really strange house. It was an old house, and it used to have sort of like boards, and so I closed the board, closed it, suddenly went up, and suddenly I was. It was like I was in this. Everything was dark, but suddenly I was back in something that happened to me when I was about 7 years old, where I developed pneumonia in the first 6 months of my life because my dad didn't like to hear my crying or something, and put me out in the back backyard and something. I got pneumonia, and so I all through my sort of like through probably all through my sort of up until 2021 to 2022 probably, and I still have to be careful even now. I used to get really bad in the winter. I used to get really bad cough, and I'd cough in my sleep. I'd cough on it, and there was this one night where apparently I was just like coughing, and my dad had come and sort of like yanked me out of bed, and I'd been stripped and I'd been made to stand in the centre of sort of like the bedroom floor in the dark, and I was just absolutely terrified. I did not move at all because he just shouted at me something about that because I'd kept him awake or something, and he was probably drunk, and I just absolutely frozen there, and suddenly I was back there. It's like I'd had an experience where it was as if, I would say, but whether you think of it as in psychological or terms of psychiatry or psychology, or however you interpret this experience, I was back there, And I knew that, again, I just invited, I knew the Lord wanted to take that event, what had happened in my life at that time, and take it out, and because it had defined something in me and in my personality, in my way of reaction, that was underneath the surface, but it controlled me. It was like it was in my unconscious, but it controlled me in how I reacted, and difficulty in forming and establishing relationship, whatever it was, or dysfunction in your life, in a relationship. And so there was times like that where there's one other one which I think, which again is I find a particularly vivid one, and which I think is worth sharing. I can remember being, we were in, I was in a car, and my sister and brothers, three of us that are quite close in age. I'm sort of like the oldest, and then there was another one underneath me, and then there was another year from me. Probably I think it was almost a year between my oldest, sort of like the brother underneath me, and my sister, my first sister. I think I was a slightly bigger gap between myself and there, but we were all quite close in age. And so my brother and my sister, I can remember, they were asleep on the back seat of the car, but I was awake, and I was like sitting forward, and this was before the day of seat belts and everything in cars. So I'm just sitting sort of like forward in there. I had no awareness really of what was going on, but I can remember my mum just turned around and sort of like looking at me, and she had all these sort of like tears and stuff in her eyes. And we had been to, earlier in that evening, we'd been to, it was Dr. Sanderson, I still remember his name. Dr. Sanders is in Rowhead. He was a local GP, and this is when GPs really used to be GPs, and you'd go in, and it was almost like a sort of like a family meeting. You'd sit in there, and I can remember we'd been there, but then we were on the way to the hospital. I didn't know what happened, but my mum had basically overdosed. Taken loads of and my dad was taking her to the hospital, and she was going to get her stomach pumped and everything. I can actually remember being in the but I was in the, I can remember being in the I didn't have any awareness of what was going on, but I didn't know what had happened to my mum. I just knew we were taken to hospital, and I can remember my dad, we were in the waiting room, and I was the only one awake. I mean, the other two, brother and sister, were sort of like asleep. So I can't have been much more than two, and I can remember probably three. I'll say I was three. Yeah, I think I was three, but I can remember sort of like being in the car, and looking at my mum, and I see my mum sort of like turning around, and she was sort of like, was tears in her eyes, and she was trying to smile, but she couldn't, and she was obviously very distressed. And we'd stopped in a queue of traffic at the bottom of the Mersey Road. If you're from Colchester, you'll know the roundabout at the bottom of Mersey Road. We just stopped. It still looks quite similar to what it was, sort of 40 years ago. And you sort of come to the roundabout, so there's a little bit of a queue of traffic. And I was sort of like leaning forward, and I can just remember my dad, who I didn't know was my stepdad, turned around, because I'd said something, I can't remember what it was. My mum had sort of half responded to me, but my stepdad sort of turned round and looked at me, and it was like this look. I think some people call it the power of the gaze, but it was like this sort of like look. It was like I was being blamed for what had happened to my mum. That's how I understood it. And it was like and many years later, when I was really struggling, even as a believer, I'd be struggling with this depression and this weight and this problem. And the Lord took me back to that time. And again, you say you can interpret any way you want. You can interpret it psychologically if you go back on regression, whatever you do, you're quite free to interpret in any way you want. But the Lord took me back to that point, and he said, invite me to be, excuse me, so difficult, invite me to be, to get between you and your dad. It was like, so instead of that hitting me, the power of that gaze, which was one of the roots of this depression that had got locked into me, instead of ask me to come between you and that, and it was like he just got between myself and my dad, and that, so that pain, or that whatever it was that was coming from my dad, whatever impartation it was that had caused this root of depression to get in me, he took it. And so there were some very dramatic sort of like times in periods of, in, you know, as you know, in this 10-15 years of first 10-15 years of being a believer, where it undid the dysfunction in my own personality, and I received, in a sense, a healing for that, you know, and that great sort of pit. I'm still an extremely emotional person, so I still can get up to the clouds and down, scrape on the bottom, and be very, very negative. But I now know that even when you're in sort of like the worst, most negative, horrible place, and some horrible things have happened. My life hasn't been nice, and I went through a very unpleasant sort of, you know, divorce that took 7 years, and there was some horrendous sort of emotional, you know, it's horrible when something like that goes so wrong, and it gets so nasty, and you're dealing with mental health issues in someone else as well, and back and forward to them, sort of like you know, it's horrendous seeing somebody sort of like, you know, that you love, and you're having to get them, they're having to be, you know, they're being, what we call it, being sectioned, and you know, where, you know, doctors judge them a risk to themselves or the risk of the public, and you know, I'm fortunate my first wife really, you know, really sort of like had a very, you know, she had a lot, there was a period, you know, we were married for sort of like 5 years, and probably for 3 or 4 of those she was in and out of the hospital, and she wasn't allowed out. It was like the bad, you know, it was like, it was one step down from, you know, there was armed guards, you know, on the ward and things like this, and so she was ill. She, you know, she really struggled with but in a sense, my resilience and my mental resilience, that didn't mean that was still, you know, it still took an enormous toll on me. And I can remember when I came out of that environment, because unfortunately we split up and we separated, and when I was out of that unbelievably intense emotional environment, if somebody triggered me the wrong way, I would like explode, because they didn't realise I just had to stay in control of all my emotions down the, you know, to handle, you know, my wife's illness. And so I'm not trying to say, but so I always still have to guard my own emotions and my own, and to keep some sort of stability and some sort of perspective and some sort of context to actually understand and to handle life and to handle living. So it's like when I was, you know, when I was talking to my sort of my colleague and friend, and they were talking about their struggles and struggles of of one of their children. It was like I just had this, because when they said that they were expressing, you know, that didn't have anything to live for, my life's terrible, my life doesn't mean anything, what does my life, I've got no reason to live for, and I want to die. And that was just perfectly how that just captured exactly how I felt, because in many ways, whether you believe in there's a literal devil or not, but one of the devil's oldest lies, that is one of the devil's oldest lies, is you have no reason to live, you have no value, nothing you do means anything. And so many people experience that and feel that very same emotion. It's one of the, it's like one of the, you would say it's one of the wretched, the wretched human condition. That's one of the symptoms of it, but it's like, I seem to, as they were telling me that, it was like because I obviously felt it so deeply and so acutely because of my own past. And it was like I just wanted to say to anyone who feels that or who's experiencing that, it's like you have to, I just want to try and give you a message of hope. Yes, you can come out the other side and you can actually find meaning in life, and you can find a vocation where you are not only you're being you are helping someone else, and in the helping of someone else you help yourself. I think it's Anthony Robbins, who's one of the famous motivational speakers, one of the most famous, I think he's probably the most famous motivational speaker of our sort of like our generation. And that's amazing, because that's one of the things he says. He says the greatest sense of self-worth and self-achievement and in self-actualization and the happiest you'll ever feel is when you use your life in service to other people. And that seems like a 100% utter contradiction. It's a bit like when Jesus said, if you lose your life, you'll find it. And so that's expressing almost exactly the same thought. Anthony Robbins just put it that way: the happiest you'll ever be is when you're living your life in service to others. And so it's like it just seems such a contradiction, because I think if I get this, or if I have this relationship, or if with our natural tendencies to be completely 100% egocentric and concerned about ourselves, and particularly when you're depressed, you're utterly consumed with yourself. You cannot get out of yourself. You cannot get out of your own emotions. You're utterly trapped by this. If you've never felt that, praise God that you've never felt it. But if you have, and you're in this place, utter despair, everything's trapped, and it's all just you, and you're so acutely aware of your own condition. And I am trying to get to to what when I was talking to my to my friend, and they were expressing this about about one of their children, and I just suddenly saw that it's like, if you consider your life however you think of life, if you just think of life as being given the gift of a blank canvas, it's complete, just a white canvas. And it's up to you, the whatever it is life is, it's up to you to paint on that canvas what type of life you want to have. And it's within your power, even though you don't necessarily think it is, because of the way you feel, and the despair and the negative emotions and the crazy people in the world, and seeing this intense. I had this this intense expectation on you to achieve and to somehow get qualifications, and that's what collapsed me. That's all I thought. I'll never be able to do that, and that was just a lie. And I think that's the thing. If you consider your life as this blank canvas that you can paint on and you can make and you can do, then you can discover. And it's often not even, you can discover in just the living and the journey of life what the meaning of life and your purpose for you is. And it may be that your purpose and your destiny and what you seek and consider life to be will change as you get on this journey. But don't stay sort of like locked in the prison of yourself. There's always a risk as you get outside of yourself and you attempt to improve your life and to change and to talk, and the pain of rejection and the intensity of it. But that price of that pain, of the struggle, of the upset, of the, if you like, that ability to get outward focused and to get outside of yourself and to be a blessing to others. How, I'm not talking about in any sort of religious sense necessarily here, but I mean there is a wonderful verse where Paul sort of like the Apostle Paul is talking about his life, and he says that by processing and handling the struggles of our life, we can then be of help to others that are now struggling in the way that we somehow managed to overcome. So there's many people in the world and who have radically changed the world and had such a major impact on the world. And when you look into their history and look into their life, where suffered from the unbelievable intense disadvantage, and I can remember being at a talk and listening to somebody who was a woman who was I think she'd been repeatedly raped, and she said that she found healing from the rape in the birth of a child who's the product of that rape, and it was just such a powerful somebody, and the risk that she was taking and all the criticism she received from, say, pro-choice people, but the risk that she took in sharing her story and communicating and knowing that some people are going to utterly react and criticize her but the gain and the blessing that she could be to other people who are struggling in that situation. So no matter what your struggle, no matter what your strife, no matter what happens and what has happened to you in your life, it is amazing how that all those things that seem so crushing and all-encompassing and overwhelming now can be turned to good if you allow them to be. So, obviously for me, for my journey as a Christian, for my journey as a believer, and there were times that I would spend hours, and I mean hours, I'd just put music on, listen, not even get out of bed, and I would just pray for hours and hours and hours, just praying in tongues, praying in the Spirit. And sometimes I'd get to, often I can remember there was just one phase that I went through where it was a terrible, nasty sort of, it was a really unpleasant sort of, one of these unpleasant sort of like events where I'd been it was just a little bit complicated, the sequence of events, but I knew that I was killing myself with my lifestyle, so I tried to get a job. The job didn't work out, and then I went to university, but before I went there, sort of like I'd had a flat. The council tried to sort of like repossess the flat, and they didn't do it right, and my brother and sister were living there, and they got kicked out, and it was like, and then I got the flat back, but then I had some mates who just basically using it as almost like a cannabis farm, and they trashed the place basically, and so there was rent arrears on that place. I'd been to university, went to university, came back from university, was expecting to sort of just to stay with me with my mum and dad for a bit. Then there was some complication. I couldn't, and I got there. I'd arrived, literally arrived there that night. My dad wouldn't let me in. So, and suddenly, and I had to end up going and living in this, in this hostel, this YWCA hostel at that time. And which had, it wasn't just for, it wasn't just the women, it was for men as well, that by that point, so like by, even though it was called a YWCA. And it was a bad time, that was bad, because suddenly I couldn't get a council flat because there was arrears from years before and they said unless you pay that off, I thought, and so I was living in this, so it was a bad time, and I couldn't get work, and so I would just, it was a rough time, but at that particular time I just, because I really didn't have anything else to do, so I sort of like, I'd just put music on, and I would pray just pray in tongues, and I'd pray for hours, I started praying, and around about the 3 or 4 hour mark, suddenly there would be like a eruption from a bed, and I would be weeping and crying. It was like whatever it was being sucked out and cleansing from within me. That was transformative as well. So it's like it doesn't matter how closed in and wrapped in you are in yourself, you can still find a way out. The way I found the way out was, was through my Christian journey. There was people who prayed for me, but most of the great dramatic times, there were times when some people prayed for me and had words of knowledge and said something about your life, or they'd said, "Is there Freemason in your family?" I said, "Yes, I know there's Freemasonry in my family." And I can remember, I'll tell this story, because if you're still watching by this point and you haven't thought I'm a complete nut, then this story you can probably handle this story. But I'd only been a believer for, what can I say, probably less, maybe it was less than a year. I think it was maybe between 6 and 9 months, and I had a girlfriend at that time called Jacqueline, and she belonged to sort of like the renewed wing of the Methodist Church, because we've got a Methodist church in here, traditional mainline, sort of like, which is completely ossified, but there is like a charismatic wing of it, and they were having like what they called Easter people in Llandudno, which is like a holiday village in North Wales. I was living in North Wales at the time, and Llandudno is like this holiday sort of like town. It's a town really. It's a coastal sort of like place, and they had Easter people there, and so there was a lot of evangelism. There was like a bus on the seafront, and you could talk to people and stuff, and before we would and there was like these little seminars before the main meetings, and I went to one of these seminars, and it was a seminar about, it was something to do with masculinity and maleness or something like that, and there was the person who was leading it was he was actually a Catholic priest, even though it was like a Methodist, and he was father something. He didn't have any robes or anything on, but he introduced himself as father, whatever. So he's obviously a Catholic priest, and he was busy talking, and suddenly he stopped in the middle of his talk, and he just said, "Spirit of fear, in the name of Jesus, leave this room." And when he said that, I literally got thrown backwards, like a meter backwards, and literally, I didn't, and I started to shake and quake, and it was like, and I thought, what the, something's going on here, and after the meeting, I went up to see him. I said, "When you said that," I said, I got thrown backwards. He said, "Come and see me during the afternoon counselling sessions or something." I had afternoon because I'd have a meeting, and then a big meeting where everybody was together, and then people would go off to these smaller meetings, and then they'd have counselling and stuff as well for people. And he said, "Come and see me after the meeting." And so so I just went sort of like in the room and I was chatting to him and everything. And he said, "Oh, can I just pray for you?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he was just praying. And he said, "Have you got Freemasonry in your family?" And I said, and I knew I did. I knew because we're sort of from sort of Scotland, especially during the time of my sort of like my grandma's time. Freemasonry was everywhere. I mean, everywhere. It's just built into Scots sort of like society, and we're sort of like in Newcastle here, and it's border city, and it's all over Newcastle because so many Scots moved to Newcastle as well. So, and it just destroys a place, Freemasonry. So like secret sort of like society, and it just corrupts the police, corrupts the judiciary. It's just a horrible thing, and it just causes this decay to come into society. But but he actually, just through praying, he got what's called a word of knowledge, and he said, "Is there Freemasonry in your family?" And I said, "Yes, yeah, I knew because my granddad actually showed me her dad's sort of like Freemasonry sort of. It was like a little. It was like the rules of the lodge, because they're sorted into sort of like to lodges, and you have to be initiated into the lodge, and there's all these various degrees, and they get more and more secret the more degrees. I think it's something like 30 degrees or some 32, maybe 32 degrees or something, and it gets more and more secret the higher you get up, and it gets more and more occult and Luciferian by the time you get to the top. You're worshipping Lucifer by the time you get to the top, and Lucifer's not considered bad. He's not considered, Lucifer isn't considered the devil. If the biblical view is that Lucifer fell and became Satan, whereas people who are Luciferians don't. They just believe that Lucifer is still the light bringer and the bright morning star, which is what Lucifer means. And so by the time you get to the top of the Freemasons, it's Luciferian, and so he said, "Are you a Freemason family?" I said, "Yes." And I said, "I know." And he just said, "Well, what we're going to do," he said, "I'm going to pray. I'm going to use the sword of the Holy Spirit and the blood of Jesus, and you're going to be completely separated from that, because the blood of Jesus breaks the power of any other covenant." And I go, yeah, I don't think I'd sort of like, this was that was sort of new to me, but the intensity of the experience I'd had sort of like maybe, and I'd had some teaching on the power of the blood of Jesus and the ability, blood covenants, that's all over sort of like every tribe, every civilization, had, an era in which blood covenants were made, and it's the most powerful thing. I said the blood of Jesus is the blood of the Son of God, breaks the power of any other covenant. And so he said, "That's what we're going to do. So he just got me to renounce Freemasonry, and he said, "I'm taking the sword of the Holy Spirit and I'm cutting you free by the power of the blood of Jesus for this." And all I can say was, it was as if something enormous in me was being pulled out of me, emptied out of me. And then suddenly he said, "Lord, just fill him with the Holy Spirit." And suddenly it was like getting really seriously stoned without any of the problems of being drunk or taking loads of drugs or anything. I literally was like, I can remember because we were sitting on the beach after this had happened, and it was like floating on. I felt like I'd been, it was like, it just felt absolutely amazing. That's all I can say. It was like, it's like I say, I felt like I'd been, smoking joints for about 12 hours or something, just utterly, completely stoned out but great, you know what I mean? I wasn't just passed out. And we were sitting on the beach, and apparently this film, I can sort of vaguely remember it. I can remember, and it was like a film crew to advertise for next year's Easter people, and they were just recording, interviewing people and recording. And I'm saying, yeah, all these devils came out of us, and I got free from the spirit of Freemason, and apparently it made the video for next year. I never saw it, but I couldn't help it. It's like when you're completely sort of like, completely pissed, and you're sort of like, you're drunk, and you're sort of, you're completely extrovert and loud, and that's what I was like. And it was just coming out because I wanted to express what had happened, and the enormous intensity and the enormous ability of, I'd just been, this thing that had been in us that had controlled my life for so long was completely gone. And so that's just part of the journey of life. But it was amazing because that experience, like I said, you can use that experience and you can be a comfort to others. So it may be that you're completely trapped in on yourself at the moment, but if you decide to consider life as this blank canvas and paint on it, and then to make your life what it is, and to find hope, and to just hang on, and when you actually get through to that place, and if you grow spiritually and you start getting these mature people who can minister to you, and that you can open up and trust, and who understand the power of the Holy Spirit to completely give you beauty for ashes, then the oil of joy for the spirit of heaviness. There's always hope, and you should never give in to despair and thinking that life is meaningless, or that there is no purpose. Okay, so that is my message, is that you can come out the other side. You can live, my favourite verse in the whole of the Bible is John 10:10, and it says, "The devil comes to kill, to steal and to destroy, but I have come to give life, and life in all its fullness." And so the promise of the Lord is that if we keep walking through, and if we don't give up, we all get to a place where we do get to life, and life in all its fullness. Because in a sense, when Jesus said that the devil comes to kill, to steal and to destroy, when we're trapped inside of ourselves, that's just an expression of this kill, this stealing, this destroying. And we can come out the other side of that and come into life in all its fullness. The devil is always trying to persuade us, however you think of the devil, I don't care how you think of the devil, whether you think it's personal or however you think of it, I don't care about that at the moment. I'm not arguing the finer points of the theology with it, but the devil, whether you just even if you just consider all the negative stuff of life and the things that is being thrown at you, and the messages of our culture, the messages of a society, the violence of our music, and the violence of people to one another, and the cruelty and the pain and the hurt that people inflict on one another, all that's an expression of this kill, this stealing, this destroying. But the promise that Jesus says is that I will give you life, and life in all its fullness. So live life, and live life in all its fullness.